Welcome back to Spilling Tea, the show where we talk about the things people do and the things people pretend to do. I'm your host, Colleen, and today we're diving into a topic that is absolutely everywhere. It's in politics, it's in the workplace, it's in churches, and of course, it's on social media. And if we're being honest, it's occasionally staring back at us from the bathroom mirror. Today, we're talking about performative virtue signaling. Now, before anyone starts clutching their pearls, let's define what we're actually going to be talking about. Virtue signaling is when someone publicly expresses a moral position primarily to gain social approval, admiration, or status rather than to create meaningful change. So in simple terms, it's saying, look how much I care, and not, here is what I'm doing. Psychologists often describe it as moral posturing or status seeking through ethical expression. And listen to me, most of us have done this at least once. Sometimes it's a moment, sometimes it's a habit, and sometimes if we're not careful, it can become a substitute for actually doing the hard work that our values require of us. Today, we're going to be talking about the psychology behind virtue signaling, why humans do it, why social media supercharges it, how it affects relationships, and how we can tell the difference between genuine virtue and performance art with a ring light. So pour yourself some coffee, grab your tea, and let's get into it. The phrase virtue signaling became popular around 2015 after British journalist James Bartholomew used it to describe public displays of moral approval that seemed designed more for image than action. But the behavior itself? Ancient! Humans have been performing morality since humans existed. Before Instagram, people impressed the village. Before Facebook, people impressed the church. Before LinkedIn, people impressed whoever controlled the grain supply. The stage changes, but the performance stays remarkably similar. And that happens when people use moral or political conversations as opportunities to enhance their status. Notice something important there. The problem isn't caring. The problem isn't speaking up. The problem isn't advocacy. Those things can be wonderful. The distinction is motivation. Here's the difference. Genuine advocacy says, I care about this issue and I'm willing to do something about it. Virtue signaling says, I care about this issue and I would like everyone to notice. One focuses on outcomes, the other focuses on appearances. And that's where it gets interesting because once people receive credit for appearing virtuous, they sometimes feel less pressure to actually live it out. Something that researchers have found equally interesting is moral licensing. And that is when people feel they've earned moral credit by expressing a good value, which then makes them more comfortable acting less ethically afterward. Basically, it's like the brain saying, congratulations, you were posted a quote about compassion. You've earned one free judgmental comment. It's like emotional cashback rewards, only worse. And let's be honest, most human behavior becomes easier to understand when you remember one thing. People tend to move toward whatever rewards them. And virtue signaling can be surprisingly rewarding. It can help us feel connected. It can help us gain status. It can give us social validation. And perhaps most appealing of all, it can create the feeling of doing something meaningful without requiring the cost of actually doing it. So let's look at why our brains find this so attractive. First, there's belonging. When people publicly align with moral causes, they're communicating group identity. They're saying, these are my people. I'm on this team. I share these values. It isn't much different from middle school, if you ask me. The accessories simply changed. In middle school, it was the correct sneakers. Today, it's the correct hashtags. Same species, more expensive phones. Second, status. Sometimes people aren't just looking for a group. Sometimes they're looking for status within the group. Researchers Justin Tosi and Brandon Warmke describe moral grandstanding as a form of status competition. So in other words, people compete for moral prestige. Have you ever seen this happen online? I know you have. We see it almost every day on Facebook. Somebody posts, "I'm concerned about this issue." Another person responds, "Concerned? I'm devastated." Then somebody else says, "Devastated? I've been devastated since 2019. Then there's that person that swoops in and finally says, "Actually, if you're just now becoming devastated, you're part of the problem." And suddenly everybody is competing in the moral Olympics. Gold medal in outrage, silver medal in indignation, bronze medal in being offended by somebody else's outrage. The issue isn't whether people care. Some of them absolutely do. The issue is that concern can quietly become competition. And once status enters the conversation often changes. Third, dopamine. Let's talk chemistry, folks, because your brain has opinions about all of this too. When people receive likes, hearts, shares, comments, and approval, the brain rewards them. It feels good to be validated. It feels great to be noticed. It feels great to be applauded. And the fascinating part is that your brain often responds to social approval long before any real-world action has happened. A public moral statement can produce some of the emotional rewards of action without requiring the effort of action. It's like my favorite, I'm guilty of this, ordering exercise equipment and feeling healthier before opening the box. The box is still sitting in the garage, but emotionally, you've already started the fitness journey. Fourth is convenience. And honestly, this might be the biggest reason of all. Real virtue costs something. Costs time, energy, sometimes money, definitely discomfort, a lot of patience, forgiveness, and humility. Real change usually requires some sort of sacrifice. Virtue signaling often doesn't. A post takes seconds. A slogan takes minutes. A hashtag takes even less. Real virtue costs something. Virtue signaling costs almost nothing, mostly your battery life. Now, let's talk about performative activism and its cost, because this is where virtue signaling starts having real-world consequences. Performative activism happens when public support becomes a substitute for meaningful action. The activity is visible, but the impact is minimal. Street protests are a good example of why the distinction matters. Simply showing up at a march, posting photos about it on social media, or carrying a sign doesn't automatically create change. Sometimes protests help organize people, maybe influence public opinion or pressure decision makers, and eventually that can lead to tangible action. But other times they function mostly as a public display of identity and beliefs, generating attention for the participants more than results for the actual cause. That's why critics often describe some forms of activism as virtue signaling. The question isn't whether someone attended a protest. The question is, what happened afterward? Did the protest lead to volunteering, voting, fundraising, community organizing, policy proposals, or other concrete efforts? Or was the primary goal to be seen taking a stance? Genuine advocacy asks, what can I do to help solve this problem? Virtue signaling asks, how can I show people that I'm on the right side? One seeks impact, the other seeks recognition. It's activism that photographs well. Posting about voting but never voting completely blows my mind. Posting about homelessness while never supporting organizations that address homelessness is another example. Posting about environmental responsibility while flying to every conference in a private jet. Talking to you, Hollywood. The concern isn't that people care. Caring is great. The concern is when posting becomes the finish line instead of the starting line. Awareness matters, but awareness without action is often just marketing. And occasionally it's marketing ourselves. At first glance, this might not seem like a huge problem. After all, what's the worst that can happen? Somebody posts a slogan, somebody gives a dramatic speech. No big deal, right? Sometimes, but not always. One cost is polarization. Performance rewards certainty. Real conversations require curiosity. If the goal is understanding, people will typically ask questions. If the goal is applause, people will make speeches, and speeches rarely change minds. Another cost is exhaustion. When every issue becomes a public performance, people get tired. Conversations feel loaded. Questions feel risky. People become afraid to admit they don't know something or have changed their minds, which is unfortunate because growth usually starts there. Then there's distrust. When enough people start performing goodness, sincerity becomes harder to recognize. People begin wondering, do they really believe this? Are they doing anything about it? Or is this just branding? And eventually, authentic acts of kindness get treated with the same suspicion. It's the moral equivalent of getting so many scam calls that you stop answering your phone, even when your mom is the one actually calling. But maybe the biggest cost is this. Virtue signaling doesn't just fool other people. Sometimes it fools us too. When talking about a value begins to feel like living it, we can mistake expression for action. And that's where the real danger begins. I hope you're still with me because now we're heading into my favorite section, relationships, because oh lordy, this is where virtue signaling gets really interesting, or at least I think so. Relationship virtue signaling happens when someone uses moral, spiritual, or emotionally intelligent language to appear mature rather than doing the hard work of actually engaging. The words sound impressive, but the substance is often missing. For example, I'm just trying to be respectful. Sometimes that means I don't want to have this conversation, or I'm honoring your boundaries, when what the other person hears is I'm avoiding your feelings, or I'm praying for you, when what the moment may actually need is I'm sorry. Now, let me be clear. There is nothing wrong with prayer. I do it every day, multiple times throughout the day. Prayer is powerful, but sometimes people use spiritual language to avoid personal responsibility. And scripture actually addresses that tension too. In 1 John 3:18, we're told, "Let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Sometimes love sounds like a prayer, and sometimes love sounds like, I was wrong, or I hurt you, or how can I make this right? Respect is wonderful, and boundaries are wonderful, but none of those things are the problem. The problem is when they're used as substitutes for accountability. Sometimes the appearance of understanding replaces actual understanding. And it isn't always spiritual language. Sometimes it's performative language. Have you ever met someone who seems to be constantly presenting a carefully constructed version of themselves? Not necessarily dishonest, not necessarily manipulative, just curated. Every response sounds polished. Every opinion sounds wise. Every conversation somehow feels rehearsed. And after a while, you start wondering which part of this is real, because authenticity rarely feels like a performance. It feels like a person who is comfortable enough to simply be themselves. I think a lot of people have experienced this at some point in their life. Maybe you've talked with someone who seemed thoughtful, emotionally intelligent, or spiritually mature, and yet something still felt slightly off. Not because they were rude or unkind, but because you somehow left feeling less understood than when the conversation began. Then eventually, you decide to be honest, and you may say something like, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm uncomfortable, or something about this just isn't sitting right with me. And their response sounds beautiful. The words are polished, the tone is kind, the delivery may even be impressive, but when the conversation ends, you realize that your concern was never actually addressed. There wasn't, thank you for telling me, or I can understand why you feel that way, or help me understand what you're experiencing. The response sounded good, but the concern itself remained untouched. And that's what makes relationship virtue signaling so difficult to recognize. It's often easier to spot arrogance than performance. Performance can look incredibly mature from a distance until you're the one having the conversation. Have you ever walked away from an interaction thinking, wait a minute, did they actually hear what I was trying to say? Not, did they agree with me? Not, did they respond perfectly? Just, did they hear me? Because being impressed by someone and feeling understood by someone are two very different things. And most people would choose understanding every single time. When someone says, I'm overwhelmed, I'm struggling, or I'm hurting, they're rarely asking for a perfect answer. They're looking for empathy. They're looking for curiosity. They're looking for a genuine attempt to understand their experience. Sometimes the most meaningful response isn't profound at all. It's simply something like, thank you for telling me. I hear you. Those responses aren't impressive and nobody's putting them on a coffee mug, but they're real. And real connection almost always matters more than impressive words. Because at the end of the day, people don't just want to be respected, they want to be heard. Now, here's why all of this matters, because appearances can be convincing. A person who constantly talks about kindness may not actually be kind. A person who constantly talks about honesty may not actually be honest. A person who constantly talks about humility may not actually be humble. Sometimes we unconsciously assume that talking about a virtue is evidence of possessing that virtue. But those aren't the same thing at all. In fact, our brains do this more often than we'd like to admit. In psychology, this is often connected to something called the halo effect. We see one positive quality and automatically assume several others. And the result? We trust people way too quickly. We ignore warning signs. We lower our guard. We mistake the image for the reality. I can only speak for myself, but historically, my trust settings were basically accept all cookies. People got access before I even read the terms and conditions. And I've been burned by that. And that's where performative virtue signaling can become dangerous. Not because people are always intentionally deceptive, but because appearances have power. If somebody sounds compassionate, we may assume they're trustworthy. If someone sounds wise, we may assume they're mature. If someone sounds spiritual, we may assume they're healthy. The character is revealed through consistent patterns, not impressive statements. And that's an important reminder because human beings are naturally impressed by appearances. We notice confidence, we notice charisma, we notice the things that are easy to see. But character is different. Character shows up in consistency, in motives, in what happens when nobody else is watching. And honestly, it's probably a good reminder for all of us. So, how do we spot the difference? Here are 7 quick clues. Number 1, it costs nothing. There's no sacrifice, no accountability, just declarations. Ask, what does this cost them? Values become visible when they require effort. Number 2, words and actions do not match. Nobody's perfect, but patterns do matter. The question isn't, did they make a mistake? It's, do their actions reflect what they claim to believe? Number 3, more outrage than solutions. Ask yourself, do I understand the problem better or do I just feel angrier? Real conviction moves toward action. Number 4, the spotlight always returns to them. Ask, who is getting the attention here? Real service points outward. Performance points inward. Number 5, empathy. It's announced instead of being practiced. Real compassion isn't claimed, it's experienced. People who care show up even when nobody's watching. Number 6, the concern disappears when the audience does. This is a big one. Ask, would this still happen if nobody could see it? Character remains after the applause leaves. Number 7, you're impressed by them, but you're not inspired to act. Authentic leadership creates participants. Performance creates spectators. Jesus summarized the danger in this in Matthew 23:5. Everything they do is done for people to see. That's the real question. Not whether good is being done, but whether being seen doing good has become the ultimate goal. And before we use these questions to judge others, we should use them to examine ourselves first. The issue isn't appearance versus failure, it's appearance versus authenticity. So, what do you do when you encounter virtue signaling? Start with curiosity, not confrontation. Confrontation creates defensiveness, while curiosity creates reflection. Instead of saying, you're virtue signaling, ask questions like, what does this issue mean to you personally? And how do you put it into practice in your daily life? What action matters the most here? Move the conversation from image to action. Ask for stories and not slogans. Like, what got you interested in this? What shaped your perspective? And can you share an example? And always ask the question performance tends to avoid. What's the next step? Sometimes, though, the best response is observation. You don't need to challenge everything. Just watch. Over time, actions reveal what words cannot. And don't assume bad motives either. People can be imperfect and sincere at the same time. In fact, most of us are. Lead with grace always. Most importantly, ask yourself the same questions. Instead of, how do I look? Ask, what can I do? Instead of, will people notice? Ask, will this help? Instead of, how can I be seen as caring? Ask, how can I care well? Because the opposite of virtue signaling isn't silence, it's integrity. It's choosing substance over appearance. And sometimes the most meaningful thing you'll ever do is something nobody knows that you actually did. Real character isn't built in front of an audience. It's built in the quiet choices that nobody applauds. If there's one takeaway from today's conversation, it's this. The easiest thing in the world is to evaluate someone else's motives. the harder work is examining our own. Most of us will never know exactly what's happening in another person's heart, but we can pay attention to what's happening in our own. Are we seeking understanding or attention? Are we seeking to make a difference or make an impression? Those aren't questions we answer once. They're questions we keep answering throughout our lives. And maybe that's why humility matters so much, because humility keeps us focused on growth instead of performance. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. And if you enjoy these kinds of conversations, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. And feel free to share this with someone who enjoys deep conversations like I do, and strong coffee, and occasionally overthinking human behavior. Until next time, stay curious, my friends, stay honest, and keep doing the kind of good that doesn't need a spotlight. Thank you and good night.